Hello and welcome to Daily News Simplified, an answer to what, why and how of newspaper reading from UPSC Civil Services examination perspective. Now today we'll be taking up the new daily edition of the Hindu newspaper dated 15 January 2023 and also the important news which had appeared in the last week from the explained section of Indian Express. These are the list of the news for today's discussion and their timestamp has also been provided in the YouTube description. So on this note, let's start our today's discussion. So let's start our discussion with this article appearing in the explained section of Indian Express. And in this news, we need to understand about the concept of delegated legislation. And this aspect of delegated legislation is with respect to the recent decision of the Supreme Court upholding the decision of central government whereby it demonetized currency notes. So this news mentions that the Constitution gives lawmaking powers to Parliament while operational aspects can be delegated to statutory bodies. However, essential powers cannot be delegated. So in this article, we need to understand about the concept of delegated legislation and also the concept of excessive delegation. Now, when the central government or state government make any legislation, then it provides for various provisions in that particular legislation. However, one of the provisions in those legislation is also with respect to the rule-making power either of the central government or that of the state government. So this rule-making power can be said to be an example of delegated legislation. And through this rule-making power of the central government, basically the operational details of the legislation is being implemented. So the issue here is with respect to Section 26 Clause 2 of RBI Act 1934. So in this particular judgment, this particular provision, that is Section 26 Clause 2, was challenged. And the Supreme Court held that it was very much within the powers of central government to delegate the decision of monetization. So here, first of all, let us understand about this concept of delegated legislation and also the fact that when delegated legislation can be considered as excessive delegation. Now regarding your syllabus, this topic of delegated legislation becomes important both from your prelims and also from your mains perspective, especially with respect to functions of parliament and also executive with respect to delegated legislation. So first of all, let us understand about delegated legislation. So it says that Parliament routinely delegates certain functions to authorities established by law, since every aspect cannot be dealt with directly by the lawmakers themselves. So they leave the operational details of a particular legislation to certain executive authority or to certain executive body. So it says that the delegation of power is noted in law, that is statutes, which are commonly referred to as delegated legislations. And these delegated legislations specifies operational details, giving power to such executive authority, and regulation and bylaws under legislations can be said to be classic examples of delegated legislation. Now, one of the famous jurists, Salmond, has defined delegated legislation as that which proceeds from any authority other than sovereign power and is therefore dependent for its continued existence and validity on some superior or supreme authority. In this case, the supreme authority becomes the Parliament or State Legislative Assembly, because it is the Parliament and the State Legislative Assembly which has the power to legislate. Now, delegated legislation is mostly practiced in all democratic countries and can be said to be a part of modern administrative process. So it says that it is now a well-established proposition of law that power of delegated legislation is a constituent element of legislative power as a whole, and the legislature often finds it convenient and necessary to delegate subsidiary or ancillary powers to delegates of the choice for carrying out policy laid down in the legislation. So basically, the legislation itself authorizes certain statutory authorities or any government agency to carry out the details of that particular policy or the details of that particular legislation. And for this purpose, at times the legislation also provides certain rules making power or provides for certain bylaws which can be made by respective administrative authorities as well for the purpose of implementation of that particular act. So from this concept of delegated legislation emanates the concept of excessive delegation, that is extra delegation which is not authorized by that particular legislation. And this excessive delegation has been best explained by the Constitution Bench of Supreme Court in a famous case Hamdard Davakhana versus Union of India. So the Supreme Court explained this idea of excessive delegation and held that Indian legislature cannot delegate unrestrained, uncanalized and unqualified legislative powers on an administrative body. So basically, if the parent act, that is the main legislation, does not provide for any specific things, then the central government through delegated legislation or delegated legislative powers cannot authorize any particular activity which is beyond the provision of this main act or the parent act. So there must be certain conditions with respect to delegated legislation. So it says that Indian legislature can delegate legislative power subject to the conditions of laying down principles, standards, policy, subject to which delegate is to exercise its delegated legislative power. So basically the delegated legislation has to be controlled and must be according to the parent act or the main act. And in case the legislature fails to do so, then the law made through those delegated legislations can be said to be invalid. Now coming to the case of demonetization, now we need to understand that what was the issue with respect to delegated legislation at hand. So here the question was, what was the delegation of power in the demonetization case? So it says that section 26 clause 2 of RBI Act essentially gives powers to the center to notify that a particular denomination of currency ceases to be a legal tender. And if we look into this particular provision, which calls for legal tender character of notes, and here subclause 2 of section 26 says that on recommendation of the central board, the central government may by notification in the Gazette of India declare that with effect from such date as may be specified in the notification, any series of banknotes of any denomination shall cease to be a legal tender. So the central government argued that its power of delegated legislation emanated from section 26 clause 2 of RBI Act, as it authorizes the central government to demonetize any series of banknotes from any prescribed date. Now the petitioner in this case challenged this particular provision of RBI Act. The petitioner challenged the provision on grounds of excessive delegation of legislative powers, as the delegation provided is without any guidelines. So the petitioner said that yes, there is delegatory power to the central government, but it is without any operational guidelines. The petitioner further argued that since section 26 clause 2 contains no policy guidelines on how the center can exercise its powers, hence it can be said to be arbitrary and therefore unconstitutional. So basically the petitioner argued that since there were no operational details with respect to the use of delegatory powers by the central government, hence it was unconstitutional. Now the Constitution Bench of the Supreme Court in a 4:1 verdict basically upheld the demonetization which was done by the central government. So it says that majority verdict held that since the delegation of power is to the center which is anyway answerable to the parliament, hence the delegation power cannot be struck down. And more or less, the Supreme Court relied on the concept of parliamentary sovereignty. The court held that in case the executive does not act reasonably while exercising its power of delegated legislation, executive is responsible to the parliament, who are elected representatives of the citizens, for whom exists a democratic method to remove the government if they consider that the act was unnecessary. The court, while upholding the decision of the central government for demonetization, also said that the decision satisfied the test of proportionality, as the decision to demonetize currency notes had a reasonable nexus with respect to the objectives which were sought to be achieved. However, it was not necessary or relevant whether those objectives, such as of eradicating black money, terror funding, etc., were actually achieved or not. However, the minority verdict held that this decision was arbitrary. That is, the power of demonetization of central government was arbitrary. Now let's go through the opinion with respect to the minority verdict. Here the sole judge held that center could not have exercised its delegated powers because section 26 clause 2 of RBI Act only gives powers to the center when the recommendation is initiated by the RBI Central Board. So this power to the central government must have been initiated by the RBI Central Board. And since this power was not initiated by the Central Board of RBI, hence this delegated power given to the central government was unconstitutional. And the court said that since the proposal did not originate from RBI Central Board but from the center itself, hence the center could not have drawn its powers to demonetize from section 26 clause 2. Further, the court held that even if the center has the power under section 26 clause 2 to allow for demonetization, The power to demonetize any notes is a vast power which is arbitrary and therefore unconstitutional. So basically, the minority verdict held that this power of delegated legislation to demonetize any notes is an arbitrary power and not a specific power, and hence can be said to be unconstitutional. Another concern highlighted by the minority verdict was that such power of demonetization should not have been taken place through an executive order but through a legislative process. So it says that power cannot be exercised by the Center for Demonetization by mere issuance of executive notification in the Gazette of India. And in such a situation, the central government should have resorted to legislative process by initiating a plenary legislation in the parliament, which means that such act of demonetization should not have taken place through delegated legislation but through a proper legislation in the parliament. However, this is the minority view, as the majority view has upheld the decision of demonetization. Now, in this discussion, what we actually need to understand is the concept of delegated legislation and also the concept of excessive delegation. That is, when does excessive delegation takes place? And for this purpose, Supreme Court in Kerala State Electricity Board versus Thomas Joseph has explained in slight more detail as to when excessive delegation does take place. So it says that Supreme Court observed in this particular case that a delegated legislation which is ultra vires, that is beyond the provision of a particular act. So the Supreme Court observed that a delegated legislation which is ultra vires the parent act. Now ultra vires means beyond the provisions of the parent act. Then such delegated legislation cannot be given any effect and can be said to be an example of excessive delegation. So the conditions here is that first, a rule must be in accordance with the parent law or the parent legislation, as it cannot travel beyond the parent law. So if any rule which emanates from this parent act goes beyond the parent act, then it can be said to be invalid. If a rule supplants any provision for which power has not been conferred, then it becomes invalid. The basic test is to determine and consider the source of power which is relatable to the rule. Similarly, a rule must be in accordance with the parent statute or the parent law, and it cannot travel beyond. So basically, a rule cannot travel beyond the premise or beyond the policy details of what has been provided in the parent legislation. Now the second point highlighted is with respect to doctrine of ultra vires. So it says that doctrine of ultra vires envisages that rule-making body must function within the purview of rule-making authority conferred by the parent act and cannot go beyond the provisions of the parent act. So it says that any executive authority making rules or regulations has no inherent power of its own to make rules, but derives those powers only from the parent law. So it has to necessarily function within the purview of the main act or the parent law. And delegated legislation should not travel beyond the purview of the parent act, then it is ultra vires and cannot be given any legal effect. Now ultra vires also means going beyond one legal authority or legal powers. So ultra vires may also arise in several ways, such as there may be a simple excess of power over what is conferred by the parent act. Delegated legislation may be inconsistent with the provision of the parent act or parent law or the general law. There may be issue of non-compliance with the procedural requirements as laid down in the parent act, and it is the function of the courts to keep all authorities within the confines of the law by supplying the doctrine of ultra vires. So it's up to the court to determine whether any excessive delegation has taken place by applying the doctrine of ultra vires. Now, based on our discussion so far, let's go through some of the advantages and also some of the concerns with respect to delegated legislation. So the advantages are that it of course unburdens the parliament and saves more time, and it allows the executive to basically implement the operational details. So it allows flexibility to the executive or the government's agencies in order to implement the laws on the ground. Further, such flexibility allowed to the executive through rule-making powers also helps them to deal with any emergency situation which may arise at any point of time, and such emergency situation which could not have been foreseen by the parliament. So such rule-making powers also gives this kind of flexibility to address any kind of emergency situation. Now, another advantage is that delegated legislation has been considered to be a constituent element of legislative power and is practiced in most of the democratic countries and has become an important part of administrative process. Now, it also allows expert opinions while drafting these rules by the executive in order to properly implement the laws. So, these can be said to be some of the advantages or benefits with respect to delegated legislation. However, there are certain concerns as well. The first concern is the fact that this entire process of rule making power of the executive is undemocratic, unlike the law making power of the parliament, as it is done by a mere bunch of officers. Further, it increases chance of corruption and misuse of power in an arbitrary manner. Further, the aspect of delegated legislation can also be said to be a violation of separation of power, or rather encroachment of the power of the executive over the power of the legislature. Now, another set of concern is that delegated legislation may lead to further sub-delegation of power. That is, the parent law, that is the main law, provides for delegation of powers to certain executive agency or to certain executive authority. Now, this executive body further sub-delegates to other authorities at ground level in order to implement the law. So, this sub-delegation at times further leads to misuse of the powers of rule making or the power of delegated legislation. Now, another set of concern is that these rule-making power or delegatory legislation further ensures or allows discretionary power to the center through rule-making, and these discretions further increases legislations in the court or increases the judicial burden. So, these can be said to be some of the advantages and concerns with respect to delegated legislation. And based on our discussion, this becomes your practice question for your mains examination. So, the question is, critically examine the Supreme Court judgment on demonetization from the perspective of power of delegated legislation of the central government. And this question carries 10 marks. So in this article, you need to know about delegated legislation, excessive delegation, and also the doctrine of ultra vires. And this topic becomes important particularly from the perspective of polity and governance, both for your prelims and also for your mains examination under GS paper 2. Now let's take up the next news again from the explained section of Indian Express. And here we will understand this phenomena of Pineapple Express. Now UPSC often asks questions with respect to recent observation or recent phenomena which has been there in the news. So on this note, you need to know about this concept of Pineapple Express, which can be associated with atmospheric rivers. So this news says that California's record-breaking storm. What is the Pineapple Express phenomena underlying it? Over the past 2 weeks, California and other parts of the west coast of United States have been hit with a series of what meteorologists call as atmospheric rivers. So here we need to understand about this concept of atmospheric rivers and also about Pineapple Express, which causes a lot of precipitation in California. So atmospheric rivers are these long, narrow regions in the atmosphere, and these long, narrow regions carries water droplets, and it transports most of the water vapor outside the tropics. So these atmospheric rivers are formed mainly at warm areas or around the tropics, and warm water gets heated, and a long and a narrow region in the atmosphere is created which carries water droplets outside the tropics. So when these water vapor reaches the cooler areas outside the tropics, then it condenses and results in lot of precipitation, especially around California. And these atmospheric rivers generally pick up water vapor from the warm, moist air of tropical regions, and they drop the water over land in cooler regions as rain or snow. So precipitation can be either in the form of rain or in the form of snow. And Pineapple Express is one example of atmospheric rivers, as these water droplets gets carried over Pacific Ocean. So it highlights that one well-known atmospheric river is called the Pineapple Express. These Pineapple Express picks up warm, moist air near Hawaii. So if you look at the map of Hawaii, this is where Hawaii is situated. And this atmospheric rivers travels from Hawaii towards the western coast along United States and also Canada. Now if you look at this particular picture, this is the atmospheric river which caused a lot of precipitation in California in 2019. Now this picture says that an atmospheric river that drenched California with heavy rain and mountain snow in February 2019, triggering flash floods, mudslides and winter storm warnings in the Sierra Nevada. The conveyor belt of clouds and moisture stretching across the Pacific can be seen in this image provided by National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration of United States of America. So for atmospheric river to be described as Pineapple Express, its location is important. So it says that the tail end where moisture is pulled into the atmosphere must start near Hawaii. So for an atmospheric river to be called Pineapple Express, it must start from Hawaii and move towards the United States. Then the river must stretch continuously through the atmosphere to the US West Coast. It highlights that between 30% and 50% of the annual precipitation on the West Coast occurs from just a few atmospheric river events, according to the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. So atmospheric rivers occurs across the world, but it is most dominated over the west coast of Northern America, taking up the moisture from Pacific Ocean. They also occur at the eastern United States, where they often channel moisture from the Caribbean Sea. Now, the positive consequence of these atmospheric rivers is that they bring rainfall to the coastal areas, which in turn is beneficial for economic activities like agriculture, transportation, fisheries, and also ensures proper water supply. However, it also causes a lot of damage, as high-intensity atmospheric rivers leads to torrential rainfalls, flash floods, landslides, mudslides, snowfall, sheet erosion, and also at times leads to strong winter storms. And this can be an example of Pineapple Express originating around Hawaii. Thus, this news on atmospheric river and Pineapple Express mainly becomes important from the perspective of your prelims examination under the section of geography and also environment. Now let's take up this news from the explained section with respect to filling up of ozone hole. So this news highlights that a new assessment says that the ozone layer will recover to 1980 values by 2066 over Antarctica and in Arctic by 2045. Now the reason for filling up of ozone hole is because of the successful implementation of Montreal Protocol, which effectively banned the ozone depleting substances such as chlorofluorocarbons. However, it highlights that despite the successful implementation of Montreal Protocol, phasing out green gases is more difficult. Now if you look at this particular question asked by UPSC in the prelims of 2015, the question was, which one of the following is associated with the issue of control and phasing out of the use of ozone depleting substances? Options were Bretton Woods Conference, B. Montreal Protocol, C. Kyoto Protocol, and D. Nagoya Protocol. Obviously, the correct answer was B, that is Montreal Protocol. And here it highlights that nearly 99% of the substances banned by Montreal Protocol have now been eliminated from use, resulting in a slow but definite recovery of the ozone layer. So in this news, we need to understand about ozone layer, about depletion of ozone layer, and also about ultraviolet radiations, as the ozone layer prevents the ultraviolet radiations from reaching the Earth's surface. Now, ultraviolet radiations are a part of electromagnetic spectrum and forms part of the light released by the sun. Now, the layer of ozone exists between 10 km to 50 km in the stratosphere. So it says that ozone is a form of oxygen, and oxygen occurs in three different forms in the atmosphere. One as oxygen atom, then as oxygen molecule, that is O2, and then as O3. And ozone is a gas comprised of three oxygen atoms. So basically, ozone can be referred as O3. And approximately 90% of Earth's ozone exists in the Earth's stratosphere. Now this becomes very important from your prelims perspective. A very important aspect or characteristic of ozone layer is that it filters out harmful ultraviolet radiations, which are mainly absorbed in the stratosphere. Now it further says that chemically, ozone is very active. It reacts readily with a great many other substances. However, ozone also absorbs harmful components of sunlight known as ultraviolet B, and high above the surface, above even the weather systems, a tenuous layer of ozone gas absorbs UVB, which helps to protect the living beings on Earth. And Dobson unit or DU is the unit of measurement for total ozone. Now, one of the major benefits of ozone layer is that it protects the living beings on Earth from ultraviolet radiations, particularly UVB rays and UVC rays, as these are more harmful rays as compared to UVA rays. So ultraviolet radiation is one form of radiant energy coming out from the sun, and sun emits a range of energy known as electromagnetic spectrum. So in the electromagnetic spectrum, here lies the ultraviolet rays. And these various forms of energy emitted from the sun are classified according to their wavelength. And shorter the wavelength, the more energetic the radiation becomes. And in order of decreasing energy, the principal forms of radiation are gamma rays, X-rays, ultraviolet rays, visible light, infrared radiation, microwaves, and also radio waves. So the wavelength of ultraviolet rays are comparatively shorter as compared to infrared rays or radio waves, and hence they are more energetic and can be destructive. Now it highlights that ultraviolet, which is invisible, is so named because it occurs next to violet in the visible light spectrum. Now as we have already seen that there are three categories of UV radiations. These are UVA, UVB and UVC. The question is, what role does ozone plays in absorbing these different radiations? So UVB and UVC being highly energetic and hence are dangerous to life on Earth. However, UVA ray is less energetic and hence not that dangerous. Now UVC radiation is also strongly absorbed by oxygen and also by ozone in the upper atmosphere. And UVB is also absorbed by ozone layer in the stratosphere, and only approx 2 to 3% of UVB rays reaches the Earth's surface. Thus the ozone layer is highly beneficial as it does not allow the ultraviolet rays, namely UVB and UVC rays, to enter the Earth atmosphere. So it says that ozone layer therefore is highly beneficial to plant and animal life on Earth in filtering out the dangerous part of sun's radiation and allowing only the beneficial part to reach Earth. And any disturbance or depletion of this layer would result in increase of UVB and UVC radiation reaching the Earth's surface, and this can have dangerous consequences. So since the ozone layer absorbs these ultraviolet radiations, hence thinning of ozone layer becomes a major concern. So now let us understand that how ozone layer gets thinned, or why an ozone hole is being formed at the northern pole and also at the southern pole. Now depletion of layer of ozone or formation of ozone hole, particularly around the south pole or around the Antarctic, was for the first time observed during the early 90s. And by the middle of 1980, scientists figured that one of the major reason or cause for ozone depletion, especially around the poles, was the use of class of industrial chemicals which contained chlorine, bromine or fluorine. And the most common of these were the chlorofluorocarbons or CFC, which were extensively used in air conditioning, refrigeration, paints, furniture industries and other industries also. Now this phenomena of ozone hole further increased, and as you can see in this particular map taken from the website of NASA, it highlights about the ozone hole formed around the southern pole or around the Antarctica. And the shape of ozone hole formed in different years, as you can see, is different. So the formation of ozone hole is also because of formation of polar vortex. So let us understand that how ozone hole is formed and how the release of chlorine, bromine or fluorine through the release of CFC compounds impacts the formation of ozone in the stratosphere. Now coming to the reasons for thinning of ozone concentration or formation of ozone hole around Antarctica can be these four major reasons. The first reason is very strong wind over South Pole or formation of polar vortex. Now it's important to understand this concept of polar vortex. So it highlights that polar vortex is formed every winter because of temperature variation or temperature difference between the equator and the poles. So one of the major reasons of formation of polar vortex is the temperature variation between the equator and the poles, both southern pole and also northern pole. So it says that in polar stratosphere, sunlight basically gets cut off during the late fall and early winter, and also because of winter solstice. And this makes it really cold while the equator remains quite warm. So again, because of this temperature variation, a vortex is formed. So it says that a jet of stream forms to balance this temperature variation or this temperature difference. And this jet is what we call the polar vortex or the polar night jet. So this polar vortex is formed around the southern pole and also around the northern pole. So it says that the stream of jet flows in complete circle around the pole 10 kilometers or a little over 6 miles above Earth's surface. Now coming to the other reasons for thinning of ozone concentration or formation of ozone hole is the presence of sun rays during the late winters. We will understand that how it impacts formation of ozone hole. The third reason being the presence of chlorine, bromine or fluorine compounds from ozone depleting substances released because of industrial processes. And the fourth reason is cold temperature below minus 78.33 degrees Celsius in the stratosphere. Now this cold temperature in the stratosphere forms specific polar stratospheric clouds referred as PSC. So all these collectively results in formation of ozone hole or in depletion of ozone layer. Now let us understand the process of depletion of ozone layer. So it says that chemical reactions takes place over the cloud particle surfaces converting unreactive form of chlorine and bromine into reactive chemicals. Now the cloud particles being referred here is the polar stratosphere clouds which is formed over the poles. And this chemical reaction allows bromine and chlorine compounds to destroy ozone molecules by stealing one of their oxygen atoms. So ozone had 3 oxygen atoms. So these chlorine and bromine compounds steal or take away one of the oxygen compounds, thereby attaching itself, that is attaching the chlorine or bromine compounds with 2 other oxygen atoms. And this chemical reaction leaves the oxygen gas in the atmosphere as 2 of the oxygen atoms gets combined with either chlorine or bromine. And this leaves a single oxygen atom in the atmosphere. So the problem here is that till the time these polar stratospheric clouds are present over the poles, this chemical reaction will continue to occur over and over again till the time complete ozone is gone. That is till the time complete reaction takes place and the O3 molecules is further broken down because of the presence of chlorine and bromine. So this overall or this effectively leads to depletion of ozone concentration and also results in the formation of ozone hole around the poles. Now coming to the impact of sunlight, so it says that at the poles, the ozone depleting substances, namely chlorine, bromine or fluorine, attach to ice particles in the polar stratospheric clouds. So when the sun comes out again in the polar spring, the ice particles melt, releasing the ozone depleting molecules, namely chlorine and bromine, from the ice particles, and this further reacts with the ozone particles, thereby breaking the chemical structure of ozone, resulting in the depletion of ozone from the stratosphere. So once the sunlight occurs, this releases the ozone depleting molecules as ice particle melts, and once chlorine, bromine or fluorine are released, these ozone destroying molecules further harm and break apart the molecular bond in ultraviolet radiation absorbing ozone. Now another major observation is that during the southern hemisphere spring season, that is around August to October, the ozone hole over the Antarctic increases in size, reaching to a maximum between mid-September and mid-October. And this was the reason why scientists observed increase of ozone hole during October in the early 80s. Now another important aspect is that ozone depletion slows down when temperature in the stratosphere start to rise. That is when the temperature of polar stratospheric clouds increases. As this increase in temperature of the polar stratospheric clouds also decreases the polar vortex. So it says that ozone depletion slows when temperatures in stratosphere start to rise. In the late southern hemisphere spring, the polar vortex weakens and also breaks down. Now this is because in warmer temperatures, fewer polar stratospheric clouds forms and they do not persist for a very long time. And this limits the chlorine or bromine or other CFC atoms to react with ozone, thereby breaking the molecular structure of ozone. So these are the major reasons for formation of ozone hole around the poles. Now the Montreal Protocol has not only eliminated or reduced the impact of ozone hole, but it has also helped to fight climate change, because the gases which was released because of use of chlorofluorocarbons in the industries had powerful impact on climate change as they were powerful greenhouse gases. Now, after the Montreal Protocol, the industry started using HFCs or hydrofluorocarbons. Now, although it did not impact the ozone layer, these were also very powerful greenhouse gases, and the Kigali Amendment to the Montreal Protocol seeks to limit the use of hydrofluorocarbons as well, as it has a direct impact on the warming of the planet. So, this article has concluded by saying that it was easier to limit the chlorofluorocarbons as there were alternates available, namely the hydrofluorocarbons. However, limiting the impact of climate change, particularly because of HFCs and also other gases which are part of industrial process and also energy related activity, it is difficult to contain the greenhouse gases. And this article overall concludes by saying that limiting CFCs was easy, but limiting the use of carbon and its related footprints will be difficult because emission of carbon dioxide is directly linked to harnessing of energy. And here the article says that almost every economic activity leads to carbon dioxide emissions. So it will be very difficult to limit CO2 emissions in order to limit the impact of climate change. Now, another major contributor of greenhouse gas emission is methane, and it mainly comes from agricultural practices and also by the use of livestock. So it says that the impact of restraining greenhouse gas emission is not limited to a few industries, which was in the case of chlorofluorocarbons. But this overall affects the entire economy at large and also has implications for the quality of life, human lifestyles, and also habits and behaviors. It further says that climate change, no doubt, is a far more difficult and complex problem than dealing with ozone depletion. Thus, this article becomes very important both from the perspective of prelims and mains examination and gets covered under GS paper 3 with respect to your mains examination under the section of environment. Now let's take up the next news appearing in the Hindu newspaper on page number 6. Now this news says that Neelakurinji sanctuary stays on paper. Though announced in 2006, the sanctuary in Udupi district in Kerala is yet not demarcated. And because of this lack of demarcation and lack of a government order, residents of the areas that come under the proposed sanctuary often complain that they cannot even procure possession certificates of their land. So a government order empowering an official to initiate the demarcation process is still pending. And unless this demarcation process is initiated through the order of the government, the limits to the sanctuary will not be demarcated. So basically this topic becomes important mainly from the perspective of environment in order to understand about the Neelakurinji plant, and also from the perspective of governance with respect to this delay in fixing of boundaries and how it impacts the local residents. So because of delay outlining the boundaries of the sanctuary, it has impacted the lives of the local population as they are not able to have or take possession certificate of their land from the government or from the local authorities. And even the local authorities, namely the panchayat, says that unless the government initiate the demarcation of boundaries for the sanctuary, they cannot issue these possession certificates. So this news highlights that on 6th October 2006, many years ago, the then forest minister had announced 32 square kilometer Neelakurinji sanctuary in the Kutakambur Vattavara area in Devikulam Taluk in Munnar in Kerala. And the main aim of the proposal was to protect the Neelakurinji plants which blooms every 12 years. However, after 16 years, the proposed sanctuary is still on paper and the boundaries are yet not demarcated. Here the news highlights that even the sub-collector said that without government's official order on the sanctuary limiting the boundaries, settlement process with respect to the land cannot initiate. And since settlement process cannot initiate, the government or the panchayat cannot issue possession certificate for the lands. So without the boundaries of the sanctuary being fixed, the buffer zone boundaries in the panchayat cannot be fixed or finalized, and hence this is creating a problem for the local residents. So it says that to start the process, the government should issue an order to empower an official to conduct the settlement process. And once the area is demarcated, only then the residents can have their possession certificate of their land living around the Neelakurinji sanctuary. Now coming to the environmental aspect of this news, the Neelakurinji is a shrub And this shrub is found along the Western Ghats in the Shola forest in South India. And the speciality of the flower is that it blooms in 12 years. Now the Shola forests are wet temperate stunted evergreen forest. The trees have crooked branches with an abundant supply of moss, lichens, orchids, epiphytes and pteridophyte, making the entire system hygroscopic. Now hygroscopic refers to the phenomena of attracting and absorbing water from the surrounding atmosphere. So it says that to avoid high velocity western monsoon winds, the Shola trees have developed interlocking branches, and the grasslands where Kurinji plants are grown are open meadows and valleys in midst of misty hills. Now as you can see in these pictures, these are the blossoming Neelakurinji plants in Kerala or found along the Western Ghats. Now since these plants grow every 12 years, so their sightings are very rare, and it was last seen in 2018 and next will be seen in the year 2030. So the Neelakurinji sanctuary was a continuum of the Neelakurinji plants from Eravikulam National Park, which is located along the Western Ghats in the Idukki and Ernakulam districts of Kerala. And the blooming of these flowers happens during September to October. And when these flowers bloom every 12 years, they attract a lot of tourists in the area. It further says that the Nilgiri Hills or the Blue Mountains get their name from the blue Kurinji flowers that cover the entire landscape after a period of 12 years when these flowers bloom. It says that apart from Western Ghats, these flowers can be seen in the layout of Eastern Ghats, namely Idukki districts, Agali Hills, Palakkad, Sanduru Hills and also Bellary in Karnataka. Ooty is also home to 33 variety of Kurinji flowers and is popularly called the Blue Mountain or Kurinji flowers that cover the landscape. And apart from Ooty, one can see the blue bright flowers in their glory in Kunnur, Lamb's Rock and Kotagiri. So these are some of the important highlights with respect to Neelakurinji plants which grow every 12 years. And these plants will be seen next in the year 2030. Now let's take up our last news appearing on page number 11, and this news highlights about the Tonga waves or Tonga volcanic eruptions which occurred last year in January 2022. Now first of all, we need to know about the location of Tonga. So here is Tonga located just above New Zealand. So it says that the forces because of volcanic eruption at Tonga generated last year created globally observable atmosphere waves according to a new study. Now so far the impact of the explosion of Tonga was not fully comprehended. So it says that as it was the largest recorded volcanic eruption post eruption of St. Helena, which occurred in 1980 in Washington in United States. So after the eruption in Tonga, scientists performed a detailed mapping of seafloor to reach new findings. So the seafloor was sculpted by violent debris flow up to a distance of over 80 kilometers, and this essentially reshaped the Pacific seafloor. Now when the underwater mountain erupted, the ash and water vapor reached up to 55 kilometers into the stratosphere. Now another major shift which has happened because of Tonga eruption is that the volcano's crater is now 700 meters deeper than it was before. So during an eruption, the hot magma forces the oceanic crust open, and this can at times leads to tsunamis, which is basically a series of ocean waves caused by displacement of water because of underground volcanic eruptions. So I've taken this picture from the website of Al Jazeera. It says that it highlights about Tonga volcanic eruption. So it says that underwater volcano in South Pacific erupted, causing significant damage and sending plumes of smoke 20 kilometers into the air. And now the researchers have found that the ash and water vapor reached an altitude up to 55 kilometers into the stratosphere. Now interestingly, most of the volcanoes of the world are found along the Ring of Fire around the Pacific. So as you can see, this is the Ring of Fire and here is Tonga right on the Ring of Fire. So it says that there are some 1350 potentially active volcanoes around the world, and many are located around a 40,000 kilometer arc known as the Ring of Fire, which is basically this arc referred as the Ring of Fire. And here is Tonga in the Pacific Ocean close to New Zealand. So this news becomes important mainly from the perspective of prelims with respect to the environment and also the location of Tonga eruption. With this, we come to an end to today's discussion. Thank you for watching DNS.